Gaelic football on Off the Ball.
With AIB, proud sponsors of the GAA Senior Football Championship. Check out #TheToughest for more.
You're welcome back. Well, here we are on the first day of August and the Men's Football Championship has come and gone just like that. To reflect, praise and critique, we have assembled three wise men, wise and grumpy. Mick Foley of the Sunday Times, hello.
How are you doing?
We have Maurice Brosnan of the Irish Examiner. Maurice, great to have you with us.
Hi, Joe.
And Colm Keys of the Irish Independent. Hey, Colm.
Hi Joe, how are you?
Very well, so we'll get stuck in. A word maybe on Sunday, Colm, from Dublin's perspective. Talk about a plan coming together.
Yeah, really probably hatched on the day or the days after Kerry beat Dublin in the All-Ireland semi-final last year. I think that's when Jack McCaffrey and Paul Mannion, certainly something stirred in them watching that. Paul Mannion was in Boston watching it. Jack McCaffrey was elsewhere, but I think the two of them were in touch and they both felt the same thing at the same time, that they felt it for their ex-colleagues, and while they were happy to be away for a long time, the sense that they weren't pushing on and they weren't continuing to win All-Ireland titles, and they had obviously left it in a good place when they departed, and that sense that they were staggering and stuttering a little bit, and I think there was perhaps a little bit of guilt felt on behalf of Mannion and McCaffrey. So that was the first move back. And of course, then later on, it's Stephen Cluxton, and in between Pat Gilroy. So Pat Gilroy is another probably a key factor here. They added some layers to their coaching team. They added a former Dublin minor manager, Ger Ryan. He was in with them. Gilroy obviously came back, and that's great familiarity for a lot of those earlier players as well. And obviously Cluxton, he came back, and it looks like it's around the time of James McCarthy's wedding last Christmas when a lot of the strong conversations came around to getting him back. So they were feeling really good about it going into the season. They had a good enough league, obviously culminating in Division 2, but I think it's really after the break, and they might have been away in Portugal last April for a training camp, and it looks as if it really, really took off from there for them. They obviously had that sense that they wanted to climb back up that hill. The measure of them, I suppose, of any team really is, okay, they were on this sequence of wins, 6 wins for most of them. But how did they react to those 2 defeats? And that was the great question for them. And I think it really challenged players like Brian Fenton. You read his interview across the papers this morning, and you know how adamant he was in remembering. It's hard to reconcile that he actually remembers that he was the closest to the Diarmuid O'Connor kick in the 2021 All-Ireland semi-final that Diarmuid O'Connor keeps in, that really Kevin McLaughlin gets the score that kick-starts that Mayo comeback, and Fenton felt a bit of guilt that he was ushering that over the sideline, and O'Connor comes in and he remembers this, and you think, how does you think that's something so minute, and yet that's what's helping to drive him. And I just think the Kerry factor, Kerry came back, took a bit of their thunder and glory, and David Clifford was being spoken about in terms of the greatest ever, and has been, and probably still, despite last Sunday, and I think we'll obviously be talking about that again. But this is the greatest ever team, and yet they were perhaps felt a bit overshadowed by the greatest ever, or potentially the greatest ever player, in terms of the conversation around all of that. So there was a lot of driving points. But I think ultimately, for them, and I wouldn't like to play on the Clifford factor too much, it's probably a small enough factor, but I think for them to reclaim the former glory and to do it with so many elements of the past or the recent past coming back in to help them and guide them, I think there was a real communal spirit there, a real sense of togetherness that we probably don't appreciate about Dublin, that it's there. They're very, very tight-knit. You talk about tight-knit club teams or tight-knit county teams from smaller but Dublin's actually, the Dublin GAA landscape, it can be quite small, and they really are. We think it's such a big population, there's so many strands to it, and there is a lot of diversity there. But this group are really, really tight, and they're driven by that 1993 group of Fenton, Kilkenny, Small, Mannion, McCaffrey. And you get a guy back in like Jack McCaffrey around the place, and he's just infectious. So he's part of the furniture there. They brought that furniture back in, and away they went.
Mick, with regard to the legacy of this Dublin group, I'm curious as to what you think Sunday adds to it. Their excellence hardly needed reaffirming, but I don't know, it maybe borne out by the warmth of the celebrations and the emotion. It's now not a team with just uninterrupted excellence. There's kind of a three-dimensional tale there. I feel this All-Ireland will be quite well remembered.
Sure, look at, I think James McCarthy said it, and I'd say for a good share it's the best one probably of them all, apart from your first, you know. First is obviously always special, but it was an enormous All-Ireland for them, really, when you look at it in the round. And you know, I was chatting to somebody before the game. I was chatting to Joe Marahertig, now of West Kerry, from Dublin, and Clare, and journalist, and we were talking about Kerry in the mid-80s, you know, when Kerry lost to 5 in a row in 82 and came back in 84. Joe was like, they won 3 in a row when they came back, but we were saying they only needed to win one, really, to kind of settle what had been raised by, again, like the parallels of history. That Kerry team only lost 2 games, really. Like, they lost the All-Ireland final in 82 and they lost the Munster final to Cork in 83. Same as Dublin now, this time around. Dublin lose 2 All-Ireland semi-finals. But the question arises, Kerry come back that time with a little infusion of new blood. Dublin the same this time over a couple of years. So yeah, it does so many things, this All-Ireland title. Like, number one, it confirms, it settles any anxieties they had themselves over the previous couple of years. Colm mentioned there, like, about Brian Fenton kind of, you know, mulling over being the man that was close to the German O'Connor. Like, this is how these guys, that's how they won 6 in a row, because they'll mull over the stuff that went wrong, you know, they'll mull over the stuff that they need to do better all the time, and that's probably what drove that generation on. And the talk over and again, I've heard anyway since Sunday night, has been, it wasn't so much about putting a 9th in James McCarthy's pocket and Cluxon and Fitzsimons. It was about putting a 1st or a 2nd medal in some of the younger lads. So now that there's a standard set for them, and now they know, even if Dublin go into a dip or whatever in the next decade, the boys are there, they know what it takes to win an All-Ireland. What it does as well is, and I mean, I doubt if Dublin were thinking this way, but now they can think this way. So, like, if Kerry had won it, you're looking at 3 in a row next year, and all of a sudden we're having a completely different conversation about where this particular Kerry team lies in the pantheon. But now, it's a 1. We're looking at Dublin have won 1. No one is really seriously saying Dublin are shoe-ins for 2 in a row, because they're waiting to see who's going to be left standing next January. And then when you look behind, the pack is so close that suddenly, you know, the idea that going from 3 in a row, suddenly the climb back for Kerry, and I'm not saying they'll be right there next year, obviously, again, but the climb back from where they were last Sunday evening and the possibilities to getting those possibilities again is now enormous. So Dublin will take a lot. Dublin will take a lot from that, and the fact that they've said, I think it's one of the most important All-Irelands Dublin have won in the modern era, and I mean in the last 70 years is what I mean by that. Like, it puts a flag for the guys that come next if things do go into a dip, and that's not to say they will. Yes,
and Maurice, the most difficult question of the 3 openers to you, what is your sense of Dublin 2024?
That's a very good question, and it's a very difficult one.
It's a horrible question.
And the truth is, I mean, nobody can answer that question legitimately or claim that they actually know, because we don't know. I mean, if you were to put an over-under on how many players and maybe management and selectors are going to leave this Dublin, would it be close to double digits? I'd say it might be. You're reading the tea leaves to a certain extent with this sort of stuff, but you couldn't help but notice when you're in the press box on Sunday and you're looking down on the pitch and James McCarthy arrives back out with Dean Rock and Mick Fitzsimons, and they take a moment just to try them on the pitch together, and you're looking at trying to read into what Dean Rock said after the game and what James McCarthy said after the game, and the body language of a couple of other people downstairs. It was the most, I don't know about 2 lads now, they've obviously covered more All-Irelands than I have, but it was the most relaxed I've ever seen this Dublin team afterwards. Even just generally, you know, the walking around with drinks in their hands and the banter that was going on outside the dressing rooms after. And at one stage, Kieran Kilkenny was doing his media dealings at one end of the big long corridor where they all do it, and John Small and the lads are down the other end screaming down at him about being a spoofer and this kind of stuff that you would never. And this would always happen behind closed doors previously. They would never give you the glimpse of that. And this was of all the islands for me, Joe, this was the most revealing in terms of what actually powers this Dublin, like where their mindset really is. Post, you know, we get it in drips and drabs. Bernard Brogan's book gave us a bit of it. Paddy Andrews on your own station gave us to a certain extent. But this talk of it all being intrinsic and about the process that powered Jim Gavin. It's certainly not the case with this Dublin team. Like, you've got a real sense of the hurt that they bottled immediately afterwards. You heard what Mick Fitzsimons was referencing in terms of how Dessie Farrell was talked about. James McCarthy referenced it too. You've got Brian Fenton in that same interview that Colm referenced today. He went as far as to say that, you know, his motivators were friends and family, and then he'd look in a dressing room and think of what had been said about Dessie Farrell. He, you know, admitted that openly, as well as James McCarthy. So the honest answer is I don't know. I don't know what it says about where they're going to be in 2024 until we see who's coming back and what other fuel they can draw on.
Yeah,
I'd say they had the intention all year of this being a last hurrah, and I think that probably carried on. But I think the more distance there is from last Sunday, I think they'll find it very, very hard to pull away. Like, you would hear certain fellas are interested in going travelling, and I think it might be Dean Rock's last year. After that, I'm really not so sure.
So do you think at Dean Rock's stag in Marbella they'll get around and say no, nobody's retiring?
Dean Rock, I just get the sense that maybe Dean Rock is, I don't know. I mean, how do we know really? But I just got from all the comments, you think that he is probably most ready and least willing to return. You get that sense that he really feels. But other than that, I'm not so sure it will be. I certainly thought Exodus all evening Sunday. That's the way they were, and even yes, but it's a hard thing to pull away from for them. It really is. There's a magnet there that drew so many of them back into the first place, and there's always that temptation to go again. So, you know, what we thought maybe even 2 days ago may not apply. And I'm sure when they get the euphoria around the city and just that sense of togetherness of having achieved something to say, maybe let's go again.
And there may be a sense as well of sort of, let's be careful about this. Obviously, we're talking about the older guys. So let's say, for argument's sake, one or two step away. Then there might be one or two other lads who were thinking maybe taking a year out or stepping away or whatever, that might think, well, we don't want to go off a cliff completely. And there may be a certain sense of responsibility that, well, geez, you know, we're running All Ireland, like, we're not going to be far off again next year. The juice might be worth the squeeze again, you know. So there'd be an awful lot of stuff to consider. And it's keep in mind, like, we're talking, 6 months? God only knows what's going to happen between now and then in terms of injuries, in terms of club. I think what Dessie Farrell does himself will probably be an enormous factor here in terms of some of the players. So there's an awful lot of play left in this, like, in terms of what Dublin are going to look like next year.
I think if they could get Cluxton and Jack McCaffrey, Stephen Cluxton to Jack McCaffrey to stay on, that would be a core element for it. I think a lot of other players could possibly, that may be wavering somehow, but I think those two would be essential for different reasons, because they're at completely different parts of the personality chart. They're so diverse in character and everything, but yet that's the ties that bind this Dublin team. And I think they'd be two essential characters to have around the place that would probably be the glue for everybody else in many respects. And obviously James McCarthy, totemic James McCarthy in many respects for how he leads this Dublin team. But I'd bet that James McCarthy, despite what he said, that it would be a nice way to go out on Sunday evening. I'd say it'd be even nicer for him to go back next year.
Well, look, I'm sure for starters, Cluxton will furnish us all with a lengthy statement, so we'll keep an eye out for that and go from there.
Yeah, looking forward to that.
To review the season then in a bit of depth, Maurice, I've divided the championship season into 3 acts for us. So Act 1, the provincials. To jog memories, we obviously had a very tight turnaround from the league campaign. Mayo lost pretty much the week after winning the league to Roscommon. And then Galway won in Connacht, putting 220 on Sligo and to their 12 points. In Leinster, we had Dublin putting 521 on Louth. We did have Offaly beating Meath, and I think most of us consumed that in a kind of 2 or 3 minute highlights package on the Sunday game. Kildare Dublin was okay-ish. Dublin were poor. Glen Ryan not happy about Croke Park. Munster, Kerry put 5-14 on Clare. They beat Tipperary by 20 points. I guess Clare Limerick was a very decent semi-final. In Ulster, there was Derry Armagh in the final, the penalties. New York obviously did their thing as a highlight. Clare did beat Cork for the first time since 97. But in the main, Maurice, I would say most people listening, if I hadn't jogged their memory, would not remember any of that. And the phrase shadowboxing was used approximately 48 times per day around GAA journalism. So the provincial championships are just like, it's not even live support. I mean, they're dead. They're 6 feet under.
Oh, I wouldn't be so sure. I would not. for a second underestimate the refusal to go quietly into light that would exist amongst those organisations. I definitely don't think I don't think the provincial championships would consider themselves dead, and they would still see weight in what they're doing. As a contest, you're right. I think it was very evident that certain teams didn't prioritise it whatsoever, to my mind anyway. And it did start with fireworks, as I said, with that night when we're all up late watching New York do their thing and Leitrim enjoy a bit of a nightmare. And then unfortunately it just failed to deliver from there. Like I would make the case, I think Munster didn't have, you could maybe make a case for Clare Limerick, but beyond that I don't think it had a single good game. I think Ulster probably had two. Tyrone Monaghan was good, and the Ulster final was gripping, certainly to be there. Connacht was probably, you could argue, was the best. Galway Roscommon was pretty decent. The game before that, the Roscommon game, was pretty good as well. But beyond, and obviously the New York stuff, but beyond that, it in itself wasn't as good. And then Leinster, the only highlight from Leinster for me was the semi-final, the Loud Offaly game, which was great. Like that was an absolute cracker, and it became a blockbuster. And it's arguably, after Kerry-Derry, so arguably the second best game that we saw this year. But there's two different things going on here, Joe. Like there's the conversation that you're having about the merits of the competition, which I presume we're going to get to in a second, about the group stages, and there's how the public view them. And I think we're increasingly seeing they're veering totally off kilter. Like if you look at the attendances for a lot of the provincials, they still held up reasonably. You mentioned the Dublin Kildare game, and you fast forward a couple of months later and the two teams are meeting in what should be a more significant game in Nolan Park, and there's 8,000 people there. The public they look at the group stages and they see there's only three teams going out here, there's no point in us investing in this. And for whatever reason, there are still teams who are putting stock in provincial medals. We got that sense from Armagh. I mean, they came out and said that after that down semi-final that they really want silverware. They think it's important for that group. Derry, from minute one, came out and put stock in what that meant for them. You saw it in Dublin, they made the case very, very clearly. They approached this year. Desi Farah said to us months ago, they broke this year down into 3 stages, and Leinster was a very important stage within that to win silverware. So the teams still do put stock in it to a certain extent. At least they're telling us they put stock in to a certain extent. But it definitely is struggling to capture the public, and the group stages really didn't capture the public. And that's a problem when the trajectory of your season, if anything, is going downwards, that you don't feel like there's more on the line, that the season's ramping up. That's a real issue. And I think that's something that the GAA do need to be conscious of, is how do we win over the public, like keep the public invested in this? Because when you boil it down to it, and you've seen this in the past with Super 8s, what really killed those systems is when people fall out of love for it and stop going to it.
Yeah. Mick, where are you on the provincials and where the public are with the provincials?
I think we're looking at a long game here. Like, I mean, where the public don't have a notion, to be honest with you. Right? I mean, it's year one though. I mean, it's year one of this system, right? So the public don't have a notion. The players, the managements, the media don't have a notion. No one could have possibly known in April, May how this whole thing is going to work out, right? So, I mean, the idea of where are we with the provincial championships, different teams would have taken a different tack to it in terms of importance or whatever you want to say. But, like, how they actually paced their way through a season, they were all kind of figuring it out on the fly, really, apart from Kerry and Dublin. And it's all, and Desi is fine. It's perfectly legitimate for Desi to say, like, well, winning Leinster was all part of our season. Of course it is when it's a foregone conclusion. Yeah. So that's fairly a handy statement to make, really.
If it wasn't an important part of their season, they still would have won Leinster.
They still would have won it. We didn't care, but we still won it. So, like, where are we? I mean, I think the process of the provincial championship, I think the gradual kind of tugging of the rug from underneath the provincial championship's feet has started. The fact that people didn't go to the group games was because they didn't have a clue what really was going on. Yeah. Like, they were kind of like, is this a knockout? Is it? No. Is what's happening now? People didn't really get it. Yeah. And I don't say that necessarily. I don't want to sound like up in an ivory tower going, oh, we knew it all. No one knew. Right? So people did, like, generally anyway, I mean, when they would have projected out, they would have been looking at, okay, what are the attendance is going to look like? When you play more games in GAA, the attendances tend to flatten out. Right, so I doubt if they were expecting enormous crowds for a lot of those group stage matches anyway. But they would have put all their stock on the last day being the business, which it kind of was. Yeah. Right, it worked out. They would have looked at the last day of the leagues and gone, "We want that." Right, and people will have that memory next year, and people will also, for most teams, apart from Dublin and Kerry, I would say, a blip in your group games did come back to haunt you at some stage, or even a blip in the provincials, depending on where it puts you. But certainly in your group games, for most teams that would have had designs on doing something, I'm thinking of Galway in particular here, it put them in a right spot. So suddenly the group games are going to have a lot more interest next year. We're in the middle of a whole learning here in terms of where we put it. And I'd say you're going to see, again, it won't be the same for everybody, but different teams will put different emphasis on league, provincial, and then the group, maybe than what they did last year, or this year, I mean, depending on,
Yeah, no, it's a fair point. There'll be different answers depending on which county you're talking about. For the purposes of time, Colm, you might take us more definitively into the group stages chat then. Obviously, for in advance and then throughout the majority of the group stages, the criticism was, well, 3 teams going through is just silly. These are meaningless games. And then the thing exploded to life on the final day. There's an argument it was the best day of the championship. So does that salvage the group stages now in the mind's eye of people?
Yeah, it was actually the best few minutes at the very end of that last day when Aidan O'Shea and John Heslin and who else was it? It was Shane Walsh, and Shane Walsh was in Carrick-on-Shannon. There was actually 4 players. Kevin Feely obviously against Roscommon. So around the same time, there's 4 players standing over kicks, which mean their teams will either stand or fall in the championship. Now, the script writers for this couldn't have asked for any better than those last few minutes and the drama that unfolded there. I mean, John Heslin had a kick to put out Tyrone that day. Shane Walsh had a kick to put Galway straight into the quarterfinals. That's a bump on the road, obviously, that they didn't recover from. Obviously, Aidan O'Shea's kick, had that gone over, that makes a difference to the score difference that day. So the drama, Kevin Feely gets his, and suddenly it's Kildare who are advancing and Roscommon, it's Kildare advancing. So all of these things really, really mattered on that last day. So we were looking for jeopardy. The jeopardy couldn't have come really in the first or second rounds of the qualifier groups.
Yeah.
But they came on the last day. So from that point of view, and as Mick referenced there, like the last day of the league is great. You're looking up and down the tables to see who's moving here, there and everywhere. Obviously, the games are very tightly compressed together, and that impacts on crowds as much as anything. You'll see it in the league too. The first couple of rounds in the league in late January and February will be very, very well attended. And then it can tend to start to slide, and it'll pick up towards the last day. That's probably it. Followed that trend. I think on balance you have to give it time over a 3 to 5 year period to see does this format work.
Yeah.
Maybe it won't, and maybe the league format for the summer will be very much back on the agenda with the provincial championships put back to spring. That might allow a slightly later start and to free up a few weekends a little bit better. And I think really that's what this championship needs is room to breathe, because it had no room to breathe this year. We were talking this time last year, it was a week later. The championship has advanced. It's lengthened by 1 week. It probably needs to go one more week, but I think there will be opposition for the right reasons from a county like Cork that has a very expanded championship, and they really cannot move their championship starts any further back into August because they have such a big programme and they want their players playing at least in some part of the summer when the evenings are relatively long before it moves into September and the light is fading and all of that. But I have to say, I thought the group stages threw up some very interesting games. Obviously, Mayo going down to beat Kerry. They didn't care about their provincial loss that afternoon in Killarney to Roscommon when they beat Kerry, first Kerry defeat in Killarney since '95. But the last day was particularly good, and I think it probably will give it a stay of execution for a while.
Yeah. Is that where we are with it, Mick, as a final word on group? Stay of execution. We didn't hate it so much that we're going to kick up a storm over the next 6 months. So you get one more year group, and let's see if it's always that good on the last day.
Yeah, I'd say from a GA perspective, the people who actually make these decisions, there was no question of getting rid of it. I'd say they'd at least want to give it 2 years anyway, and give it to 3. Again, as I said, it'll bed in now next year. People will know a little bit more about what can happen and kind of the rhythm of the season. That's the thing, like the rhythm of the season. I think is still people are still kind of again, media including everybody trying to kind of just get to grips with kind of how quick all this happens and where are the pinch points, or what are the important things in this season. Does it matter in Division 1 anymore, does it? Because the Division 2 team just won the All-Ireland. So like where's the interesting bits in the league? When does the championship really kick in? All this kind of stuff. And also this whole thing, like we've been crying out for decades for more matches, okay?
Yes, yeah.
But now we're in a situation where knockout is being diluted out of it. So people are also dealing with that, I think, that people want more matches and they want a second chance and they want more this out. But equally, they enjoy the knockout thing. But like knockout doesn't, knockout has its place in this system. So I think people are adapting to that. So there's a lot going on.
Yes, well, that's very fair. We're going to take a very short break. Mick Foley of the Sunday Times, Maurice Brosnan of the Examiner, and Colm Keys of the Irish Independent back with us in just one moment.
Gaelic football on Off the Ball.
With AIB, proud sponsors of the GAA Senior Football Championship. Check out #the toughest for more.
Gaelic football on Off the Ball.
With AIB, proud sponsors of the GAA Senior Football Championship. Check out #the toughest for more.
You're welcome back. We're looking back on the men's football championship that was. We have Colm Keys of the Irish Independent, Maurice Brosnan of the Examiner, and Mick Foley of the Sunday Times with us. We've chatted through Dublin's success and the provincial championship and the group stages. The knockouts, Maurice, I was sort of one of those that was finding it a tough season to get into for many reasons, and there was a constant sense of wait till we get to the knockout stages, it'll be spectacular now, it'll really kick off. So preliminary quarterfinals, we had Galway Mayo in that very strong wind, and Galway bowed out. We had Kildare Monaghan last minute win. We had Cork Roscommon went down to the last minute as well. The quarters was Dublin Mayo, that epic start to the second half in Dublin's part. We had Armagh Monaghan, which finished in drama, whatever about the preceding 90 minutes, finished in the drama of penalties. Kerry did their stuff against Tyrone. Derry Cork was tough going, and then the semis, Dublin Monaghan threatened, and then you'd have to say Kerry and Derry delivered, and we've touched on the final already. So how many Maurice Brosnan stars out of 5 are you giving the knockout stages?
If you're including the preliminary, I'll say 3 out of 5, and if you're just going to go quarterfinals, semi-finals, final, I probably might knock it down to 2. But there's 2 things going on there, Joe, that I think we probably don't want to get confused. Like there's an obvious and real conversation about the playing style and what we're seeing in terms of strategy on the field, and then there's quality, just in itself quality, which I don't think, as good as the Dublin team are, I don't think they're as good as the 5 in a row, the 2019, which was probably their peak. We've probably seen a devolution to a certain extent in football, mainly that's because of COVID, I would imagine.
Yeah.
And as a consequence of that, I think there's 2 different things going on here. Like there's just general poor quality. If you look at the final, for example, it's a perfect example to me. I know maybe not everybody found the final utterly gripping and entertaining, but a lot of that, at least for me anyway, was just because of poor quality, like poor execution. You had shots being ballooned up in the air that you wouldn't normally see. Think about David Clifford did it, Thomas Sullivan did it, Colin Pascal dropped one in short, small stuff like that just wouldn't happen. Players were trying to kick the ball, but it just so happened that they were rolling out over the end line. There was goal chances there, and it just so happened they were really fluffed, and was it saved off the line or was it going wide? But by and large, if those opportunities are taken, suddenly the game becomes a classic and it enlivens everybody, and you say, wow, this was brilliant. But that's not the same as the flip side of the thing, which is the main percent, which is this kind of conservative, retained possession, going away from contests and back towards this idea of maintaining the ball. So the final is in my very specific rating system, the final is in a different bracket to those early stages, which the Armagh Monaghan game really cries out for me, from particularly maybe Armagh's approach in that game, and it belongs in a different bracket, and it's a bigger conversation about where football is right now.
Well, it's probably the conversation to have. So Mick, we might move it that way, style of play, and I mean I could not stress to you, we were just inundated with text messages, tweets across most of the championship. People just hated it. They absolutely hated it. This lateral stuff endlessly. It was kind of like a metaphor for the never-ending season, the precursor to the knockout stages, the provincials, and then the group stages. It was like watching insert team here attack, which went on for 6 minutes, and that's not a dig at Roscommon specifically. So the style of play, has been a talking point for about 20 years now. We're probably 20 years on puke football. There's a good Sunday Times piece now over the next 6 months on the 20th anniversary of that, just to tell you. But
someone else can do it.
Someone else can do it. But I would say this year, more than any, in my time doing the show anyway, people are just hating the style of football in far too many games.
Yeah, I think it's probably crossed the line somewhere along the way now, and I think it's obviously partly driven as well by the fact that people are seeing more football and there's more conversation around it, and all the rest of it. But yeah, you said 20 years. Look, football has been in a state of almost damaging self-analysis probably since they put rules on it, to be honest with you. Even the great games that people recall as great games, were maybe remembered and analysed in a different way back at the time. But
you might remember, I presume through the 90s, which for me, my childhood, were just colour and excitement. I presume on the TV, were they going back to punditry saying, this game is rubbish, what a terrible game that was?
Well, they were, because what you had at that time was probably... And Colm could probably weigh in this better than I could. Colm, I think, started in the business a couple of years before I did. But I can remember in the early 90s, by the way, I thought football during the 90s was terrible, okay, when you look back on it now. Some good games, but by and large, it was bad.
Yeah.
But you also had, at the time, you had a group of players coming into the media, so you're talking Pat Spillane, Colm O'Rourke in particular, who were beginning to analyse the game in a particular way, far more analytical and far more, I want to say cutting, but I don't mean cutting, just they said it as they saw it, which was a difference from what went before. So suddenly people started looking at football in a slightly more critical light and started knowing, well, is this actually good? And it's actually not good. And then you had the whole debate during the 90s about the knockout system, the fact you only had one game and the commando train that went on, and was the football any good in that one championship game, and so on and so forth and so forth. So you had that. So then coming into, you mentioned, coming into the noughties, the game has evolved. To me, I would have always have been of the view that the game will evolve itself whatever way it's going to go. And from the noughties through, you had some brilliant coaches, skill levels went up, fitness levels went up. Everything will eventually evolve around to a good product. Even when people were criticising it at the time, say, 3 with Throwing Armagh and different things like up there, that actually the base skills and the fitness levels here are going up all the time. It's going to be okay. But even I've come to the point now where I think there needs to be direct intervention, because as you say, it's the keep ball. Everybody is playing more or less the same way.
Yeah.
And it is interminable. And now I have to say about the final on Sunday, when I was at it, I thought I was going to have some kind of breakdown about 20 minutes into the first half. I looked up at the clock after 25 minutes, and I thought, is there only 25 minutes gone? I thought it was nearly half time. But watching it back, it actually looks better on TV than I think it did there.
It's funny because I thought it was great on TV, and I spoke to someone at it and they thought it was terrible.
There you go. It's funny, isn't it? So I think it was just this keep ball. It's the constant hand passing. It's the going back. And I have to catch myself. I hear myself saying this stuff. You sound like a geezer, like an old guy giving out. It's not like it was in my day, kind of thing. But I do actually think it's got to a point now where people are bored watching this.
Yeah.
They're bored, and I think they're getting annoyed.
Colm,
it could be so much better.
Well, I think I agree with that entirely. I did find myself, Colm, watching Mayo against Louth, and it was a beautiful sunny day outside. And Louth did the right thing, they stayed in the game. But I did think to myself, I don't want to watch this anymore. And I've never thought that over the previous 15, 20 years, even when the complaints were there.
And probably even the same. I remember, well, obviously it's only a couple of weeks back. It's only 4 weeks back when Cork played Derry in the All-Ireland quarter-final. And I remember thinking I could hear the chatter around Croke Park, just around the stands as the game was going on. And it's like watching Headingley or Edgbaston, and there's a cricket game going on, and you can hear the noise of the crowd. They're disengaged. They're even disengaged at the match. Now, obviously, for that game, the 2 goals went in quick succession. And that was a small jolt of electricity into it. But by and large, that probably equated with the Mayo Louth game too. And there were many more. Obviously, Dublin Roscommon, while it was a draw and a grave result for Roscommon. And that's the way they have to be. It's like the film Gladiator. They have to stick together when they're in the Coliseum as the chariots are roaring out. They have to do what they have to do to survive in the game and to hang in the game. I think the irony of all of this is that the levels of everything have never been better.
Yeah.
The overall product is really suffering because, by and large, and Mick referenced the 1990s, the rules were certainly different. You know, you get away with an awful lot more in the 1990s than you would even in the 2000s. Croke Park, for a start, was a different surface. It was a different place to play in Croke Park. And then the reconstruction came in 2002. And I remember thinking around then, games are different there now. And now, obviously, all grounds are different. But I really felt in Croke Park that the games started to change with the redevelopment in some way. Now, how can I equate that? I can't. But I just feel the surface played different. And the games are much more different in the 1990s. And obviously, there was far more tolerance physically of what could happen. But I do think the game is lurching towards crisis point. I think because there's less mistakes. Now, last Sunday was probably the outlier for that, but players have become so good at execution. And I think the big thing is defence has improved so much. And whether that's by numbers or strategy or better technique and a far better idea how to position. You're at the game last Sunday, you're thinking, how are Kerry going to get the ball into David Clifford? They have to engineer some space here. And I was looking at it with that specifically and thinking, Darragh Moynihan's looking up, he can't see the pass on, so he has to go back. And same for Paudie Clifford, he's looking for his brother, but he cannot get him. And that's because Dublin, the phalanx of bodies in front of David Clifford, the Dublin bodies are so well structured, so well organised that they just cannot find a way through here. And it leads to say, well, how can this change? And that's a lot of teams. And obviously it's the fundamental way to play is to pack the numbers in defence and hit on the counter-attack. And I think we can see that in some of the scoring trends now. If you look at the goals scored this year, how many have been scored by defenders? Over 20%. And that's because of the counter-attacking game, the turnover and goal. And that's about the only bit of excitement when the ball is turned over that you will get, really. Yeah. Other than a pass into the corner beneath the Hogan or beneath the Cusack stand in the hill when David Clifford got it against whether it was Derry or Tyrone. You saw the game opening up, and obviously with his goal last Sunday, but you just didn't see enough of that. So there is a real reckoning coming for the game at some stage, I'm pretty sure. And what that is, I think my own idea is to reduce the numbers on the field, to free it up a little bit, allow more substitutes, obviously, for fatigue. But I think there has to be less bodies on the pitch.
Maurice, I'll give you final words. So, they're kind of stark comments from the two lads, and I think all of us are in agreement. And I mentioned Mayo Loud and instantly felt guilty because Loud did brilliantly to stay in the game. It was ferocious heat, and the skill levels across the board are just so good that you can't fault the players or the management. And I would also say I've sat through some appallingly boring soccer games and rugby games over the last couple of years as well, appallingly dull. So I don't know, maybe that might be a slightly grim note of optimism.
Oh geez, I hope not. I hope that's not a resolution to this. Joe, I think what Colm just said there is the crux of this, and I think it's so important that we define what actually is the issue. What is it that we want Gaelic football to be? Because before you go tweaking, when I was in college, I actually the current rule trials that are going to be played in freshers football next year, we experienced those. This is a rehash of stuff that was done previously. The people keep. You mentioned that Roscommon 6 minute spell there. People, that the hand pass is a constantly a source of complaint. But I think the ratio there was nearly 1-to-1 in terms of kick passes and hand passes, in terms of how Roscommon retained possession. The hand pass isn't the issue there. The issue is the fact that they're retaining possession. It's control. Yes. There's too much control in Gaelic football. So what we want to do is incentivise teams to try and force more turnovers. Exactly as Colm said there, the majority of scores come from turnovers because that's when the game is slightly more unstructured. There's open space. Players can go and take people on. So you need to incentivise that. That's what you need to prioritise. And how do we do that is the ultimate question. Do you, a constant thing now is teams won't press up high anymore. Loud certainly wouldn't do that. So how do you incentivise teams to press high? Do you stop them from back passing to the goalkeeper? Because then suddenly you can trap a team. You can force them in the same way Dublin did to Monaghan. Dublin, actually, ironically, the best example is twice this year they pressed high, forced turnovers. They did it against Monaghan and they did it to Gavin White at the weekend. So can you enforce that? One thing from the weekend, David Goff, he let the game flow and he was a lot more open to allow the tackle. And I think if you had more of a robust tackle, I'm not saying to go to this extreme, but let's say for argument's sake, you had an AFL tackle where I could go and wrap you with both hands and drag you down. Immediately, I'd be chasing you all over the field because the chance of me getting a turnover is way higher. And then suddenly it's you have the ball, but I'm hunting you to get it back, and then I have the ball and you're doing the same. And you would inject a huge degree of excitement that way. So I don't think it's.
Maurice, I'm ready. I'm ready to pass that motion right now and just watch the carnage for a year.
But I do think that until we define what is actually the issue, rather than there's so much talk about the hand pass or fisted points or controlling possession, and then suddenly if you can tackle that, but we're all in agreement that there is an issue. I don't necessarily think we're all in agreement as to what actually that issue is, and that it's really important to define that.
Like just very, very quickly, I mean that's it in a nutshell. Like, I mean, in all the years, like talking to guys within the GAA, guys involved in committees, rule makers, all the rest of it, you ask what for football, they say we want to create chaos, contests and collisions. That's how I would describe it. These are the guys who are charged with making the rules, right? That's what they're trying to generate. Maurice mentioned it there. What you're going to see in terms of experimental rules are a rehash, but there's been loads of attempts to try and open up the game a bit, and they've been pushed back by county boards, by managers, players. There has to be some way here that we just drive rules here, because I mean it's not just about managers and players. Managers and players say, well, we're the guys who play it, and we're the ones, and they do need to be listened to. But there is a variety of stakeholders here. Like there's a GAA itself as guardians of the game who need to create rules that get the best out of football as a concept, right? You have the players and coaches who play the game, so it has to be enjoyable for them. I can't imagine that this is that enjoyable, really. No. I mean, there's tremendous collectivism and there's tremendous energy within a group when you're trying to achieve something, but it can't be much fun when you're actually going out and playing that game for long stretches. Other stakeholders, the media are here to hold a mirror up to the game in this context and say, well, here's what it looks like, and here's reasonable critique of where the game is going. And then you have the public who actually keep the game alive by going. Yes. So if you can't, I mean, Maurice nailed it there. If the first thing to do is define what Gaelic football needs to look like, and once you get that, then you need to start. But counties, administrators and players and coaches need to be a lot more courageous in terms of what they're willing to try and willing to submit to try and make the game better for a wider audience and for the game itself to actually blossom. Because it's so close. Like the levels are so high across the board in terms of skill, fitness and everything else. The game is so close to actually fulfilling its potential.
Yes, no, it's true.
We're having this conversation.
It's true. Let's park that one there. And you're all welcome back on once a month over the next 6 months to figure out how to save the game. We can endless bandwidth here. We'll do it.
The problem there, Joe, is they can't get a proper platform to run the experiments, because players and coaches will reject it. They don't want it in around the league. They don't really want it in around the pre-season, because that's long-termism, and their priority is short-termism. Yes. So when it goes down to the freshers and that, it's been thrown around. So there's no proper platform to experiment. That's an issue.
Maybe a media game at Croke Park or something. We'll have a think. In terms of controversies, like every year is defined by a good old controversy. We don't have time to get into it. Clock is very much against us. It is worth noting that, and Mick, you wrote a great piece in it one Sunday where you charted the history of the Hill. We did see violence bubble up on the Hill, and I guess we're all hoping that's really not the tendency, and it's a strange aberration, fingers crossed. So we'll just note that and move on. It wasn't like it was horrific either. The big controversy of the GAA Championship column has been GAAGO. The issues here are twofold. One, just the principle of asking members to pay. Do we really need to do that? And then secondly, the conflict of interest in the eyes of many between in RTE's position in particular, in that they're fighting for the best games for the licence fee payer, but then equally they have a stake in GAAGO being a big success. So how can they do both without a serious conflict and obvious conflict of interest? And they have very much argued there is no conflict here whatsoever. The CCCC decide all. Where are we as we head into next year on GAAGO? Do you think it'll bubble up again?
I think it'll always bubble up. It always bubbled up with Sky as well. I mean, I don't think it was a whole lot different, and it all bubbles up.
I sort of felt with Sky, it never, it stopped dominating front pages, politicians, all that kind of crack.
I suppose the conflict of interest and the licence fee, the duality there, I suppose that probably did add a different edge. But I think when there's a good game that people miss on a Saturday evening, that's really when it starts. But I think you have to look at it. I mean, the GAA came out at the very start of Sky and said it's not about the money. But actually, it is about the money, and it has to be about the money. There are stadiums around the country that, number one, aren't built. The GAA can only commit 15 million to Casement Park right now. There's a 7 million, at least, shortfall in the stadium in Louth. You have Waterford development, you have Navan, I look at Semple Stadium now, and it's the second stadium in the country, maybe the third after Parky Glebe, but it is a second stadium, and it is in need of an upgrade and repair. All of that is needed. And to generate revenue, the GAA needs to not to have its hands too tightly tied behind its back in terms of media revenue, because media revenue, if you look at the accounts over the last number of years, is one of the big areas of growth. And to make an omelette, you're going to have to break a few eggs. And if that's putting a few games behind a paywall, I think the issue for GAAGO for me is the quality of the broadband in country areas. And this probably, the GAA may have jumped onto a streaming platform too quickly. But the fundamental of some pay-per-view games has to be there so that it can generate some revenue, because if there's no GAAGO or if there's no competitors, and TG Cahir and TV3 or Virgin will come in as potential competitors, but how much can they actually pay to make the revenue, to make the media rights, to make it vibrant for the GAA so that it can? I mean, I would think that sponsorship is starting to taper off. I think probably gate receipts will taper off. If you're looking at the accounts, the area of growth for them to make that step, I think, is around the media rights. And if you're putting everything, or you're committing, as some politicians have. So Melda Munster had a statement out there pretty quickly after the Oireachtas committee, saying she thinks all games should be free to air, and she was obviously very good in her questioning and all of that. But where do you get the 7 million for the stadium in her constituency to make that shortfall? All of these things are a factor. In time, we're going to have equality of expenses with the Players' Charter, with the ladies' camogie, and obviously the GAA are going to have to play their part for that. That's all going to come into the equation too. So the GAA needs sufficient money to function, and one of the areas there for me is GAAGO. Obviously, that's hard when Cork and Tip are playing on a Saturday night, and I do think we'll see a relaxation around some of those games. But the idea that everything should be free to air like that, I think that's gone. Yeah.
Any quibbles with that, Maurice?
No, I think that's spot on. Essentially, that argument is the relevant argument, because that's what, again, the public seems to be most worked up upon. And the second issue is, in reality, is actually the primary issue, which is the relationship between GAAGO and RTE. And I think that's something that does need to be resolved. I'm talking totally separate to the product and how good it has been as a service, and we presume the developments in terms of an app and all that sort of thing will be better flagged. I think they could definitely have a bigger campaign around the pre-Christmas offer, for example, in terms of just from a pricing perspective that was there this year. That could definitely be better marketed. But if you park all that aside, there is the situation in terms of a conflict of interest between RTE and GAAGO and what that means for various stakeholders. And I do think that still needs a resolution. That's totally separate to the existence of GAAGO, which I don't think is going anywhere.
Yeah. Mick, largely in agreement?
Pretty much, yeah. Like, I mean, I think, they need to get the money somewhere. The GAA is one of the few, major sporting organisations, I use that term carefully, across the world, that would still probably be bringing in more from their gate receipts than their commercial revenue, their media revenue. So, like, there is, as Colm said, like, there's that gap is shrinking, and Maurice is absolutely right. Like, I mean, if you were to harness the energy that was whipped up around Ryan Tubridy and the whole RT controversies this summer and follow that through, you would imagine that something like RT having a stake in GAAGO will be something that will disappear very quickly, and that someone else will have to come in and fill the void. So we'll see whether that happens or not. But certainly, like, even from a revenue point of view, it's already from what we glean from those hearings, like, GAAGO's worked for the GA, so it ain't going anywhere. And they need the money. And I mean, as Colm said at the start, there's nothing wrong with saying it's about the money. Sometimes the GA and GA people, for want of a better expression, get kind of wrapped up in this whole thing about money. We need money to build stuff. We need money to fund teams. Money is okay, if it's being used in the right way it's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay to say it's for the money. So yeah, look, it's here to stay. The pay-per-view thing was junked years and years ago. That shouldn't be an issue for anybody.
Okay. We are completely out of time, so you both get 2 words here and 0 explanation, but I asked because the Footballer of the Year debate, it's very much Dublin's year, but the Footballer of the Year debate, pretty interesting on Twitter, like a more disparate range of views than in previous years, I think. So you get 2 words and no explanation, which is, that'll really set you up for criticism on Twitter, which is just what you want. So, Maurice, you can lead the way. Maurice Brosnan's Footballer of the Year with 0 explanation.
Brian Fenton.
Brian Fenton. I'm sort of leaning that way, I have to say. The more I think about it. Colm
You
Keys.
get an explanation and I don't.
Well, listen, I'll do what I want. Colm Keys.
David Clifford.
Mick Foley.
David Clifford.
There we go. Okay, fellas, that was superb. Let's pick up the what can we do to sort out Gaelic football and make it a better product in a couple of months' time. But in the meantime, Colm Keys of the Irish Independent, Maurice Brosnan of the Irish Examiner, and Mick Foley of the Sunday Times. Thanks, fellas. Enjoy the rest. Take a few weeks off.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks,
lads.
Cheers.
Okay.
And our Gaelic football coverage on Off the Ball is in partnership with AIB, proud sponsors of the Senior Football Championship. You can check out #TheToughest for more.
Gaelic football on Off the Ball.
With AIB, proud sponsors of the GAA Senior Football Championship. Check out #TheToughest for more.